Welcome back to the Matt and Eric Talk Twins podcast. We have your usual, some Twins news, some non-Twins news, probably bigger news outside of the Twins world, and maybe some talks about a little bit of realignment. But first, as always, I am Eric, and I'm here with my co-host Matt. Matt, how we doing this week?
We're doing all right. Not a whole lot going on in Twins world, but we're going to talk about some arbitration. So that's always fun.
It's certainly not the sexiest part of the offseason, but it is probably some of the bigger news that we've seen out of Twins world since the Josh Bell signing, at least. So I figure why not jump right in and get started today with our arbitration numbers coming out of Minnesota. The big news here, the Twins did settle with every eligible player on their roster outside of Joe Ryan. So, Matt, why don't you break down some of the more interesting numbers to you?
Yeah, so among the agreement guys, we had quite a few come in below their projected number. So Trevor Larnach came in about 200,000 below his expected arbitration number. Royce Lewis about 150,000. Alex Jackson almost 500,000. Cole Sands I think about 200,000. Just a lot of guys that came in just a bit below where they were probably projected, although that really gets balanced out by Bailey Ober getting 600,000 more than he had been projected for. So I think overall the Twins net payroll is about the same. It's just shifting the money around a little bit. But definitely love to see them coming to agreements with most of the guys. I think the Joe Ryan one is just interesting because they got really close to a settlement, and now they're just disagreeing over 500,000. And honestly, if it was me, 6.35 million versus 5.85 million doesn't seem like too big of a gap to try to bridge with one of the star players on your team.
I would absolutely agree. I have never been a huge fan of arbitration from a fan standpoint, just because I think it's probably the most ridiculous concept across any of the major pro sports. We're going to get in a room now and we're going to have the entire Twins organization spend maybe even multiple days telling Joe Ryan why he sucks, why we don't think he's valuable, and why he's overinflating his own ego and his own value. And even if the Twins win this arbitration case and they pay him $500,000 less, is that really worth it if you're going to have to walk in there and slander your arguably biggest, probably best piece in the organization right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why teams generally try to avoid arbitration. Uh, the one big call out, though, is that arbitration operates a lot on like past precedent. And so Joe Ryan getting $500,000 more this year might not matter a whole lot, but for other teams in the league and even the Twins with future pitchers, it hurts them to have the precedent of Joe Ryan making a little bit more money because now they're going to have to pay future players more. And I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not that important to a major league team, but you know that owners are very cognizant of spending money on players and trying to limit payroll as much as they can. And so it's, I guess, the Twins a battle worth fighting, but it just seems like the kind of thing that'll alienate a player. And Joe Ryan in particular, I mean, I don't know Joe Ryan personally. I've never talked to him, but just from how he presents himself on the field, he's kind of an emotional guy. And so I feel like it's not the type of player you really want to go to arbitration with because he'll probably take it pretty personally.
Yeah, it's certainly never a great look for the organization, but I think this one is almost doubly as baffling because the money that the Twins are fighting with Joe Ryan over is a smaller amount than the money over expectations that Bailey Ober got. And that's a guy that's a lot less important to get paid. Not that he hasn't shown promise in the past, and that clearly the Twins believe that there's underlying metrics to suggest that he's going to be closer to his career numbers moving forward than the disaster that we saw in 2025. But it is just so nonsensical for me for the Twins to be fighting tooth and nail over 500K for Joe Ryan when they had no issue signing up to pay Bailey Ober well over his expected numbers, when Bailey Ober is a significantly less important piece of this equation and a guy that doesn't really matter as much if you piss off because he could just as easily be on the trade block as he could be in these arbitration arguments with the Twins right now.
Yeah, I will say the expected numbers that we're using come from MLB trade rumors. They're kind of thought to be like the most accurate arbitration guesses, but they really are just guesses. We see them vary a few 100,000 to even at times up to a million, million and a half, um, based on what players actually get. So as far as like breaking down individual players, I mean, 500,000, 600,000, whatever for Bailey Ober probably is just within the expected margin of error for their projections. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Coming into this year and coming into last year's arbitration, Ober and Ryan had very similar career numbers and were paid similarly. Obviously, they had vastly different 2025s. And so you're seeing now the spread in arbitration for how much they're projected to make next year. But I feel like it's already not a large enough gap for the difference in the two players, and I don't think it's worth fighting Joe Ryan over $500,000. I mean, that's less than the league minimum. That's they paid Deshaun Kersey more than this difference in payroll last year. So I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I'm also not an owner, and I'm not involved in fighting the Joe Ryan precedents for the next 10 years and all the other players it's going to affect paying him $500,000 more. So
I just think my biggest gripe here is that the Twins have already so quickly reverted back to their old ways when we just saw a change in ownership at the top, not actually who owns the team, obviously, but who amongst the Polads is running the team. And with it came the usual spiel of we want to win back fan trust, we want to invest in this team, we want to get better. And then they're just doing the same thing over and over again. Not that every team doesn't have ARB cases that they take to hearings. Not that every team isn't probably fighting somebody over $500,000. But when you look around the league, if you're going to arbitration with your star pitcher, it should be over a matter of millions of dollars, like the Tigers are doing with Tariq Skubal. For $500,000, every team in the league should be willing to just open up their checkbook and appease their star pitcher. The fact that the Twins aren't speaks volumes to where they're still operating at, the mentality they're still operating with, and it is really showing their true colors to Twins fans early into this new quote unquote regime in Minnesota.
yeah, I agree. But oh well, the Twins are just doing normal Twins things. Speaking of interesting Twins things, we had old friend Max Kepler get popped with an 80-game performance enhancing drug suspension. The funny thing about this is Max Kepler did not play well last year, and honestly hasn't been much of a hitter for the last few years. I haven't seen any statements or anything from Kepler, so I feel like usually when you see one of these suspensions come out, you immediately get a statement from either the player or their agent being like, "Oh, they unknowingly took this substance, and here's the backstory." And I have not heard any of that from Kepler, so take that as you will.
So my immediate thought when I saw this, outside of being a little bit sad because you hate to see a guy so near and dear to a lot of Twins fans' hearts getting popped for PEDs, are PEDs just for bad players now? I mean, you look at guys who have been caught recently, and it's Max Kepler, who was not particularly notable. Jose Alvarado, maybe most notable because he was also a Philly, but he got popped for PEDs, I believe, before Max Kepler was even there. And you've got guys like Jerks and Profar, who was better on the PEDs likely, but not any like superstar level change. You think about a guy like D Strange Gordon who was caught using PEDs when he was with the Marlins. Like, is it weird to say that if guys are going to keep using PEDs, I want them to at least be good hitters? Like, it kind of feels like the worst of both worlds, where we're seeing guys continue to taint and tarnish the game with PEDs, and we don't even get to watch Bonds, McGuire, or Sosa esque performances out of them.
I mean, I think it makes sense. Like if you're a marginal big leaguer, it makes more sense for you to take drastic steps to improve your career. Because like if you're already Juan Soto, right? You don't need to take PEDs because you're going to make $700 million without them. You're going to be an elite player. You're not financially incentivized to take the risk and try to go become better because you're already going to be set for life without taking a risk. If you're a guy like D. Strange Gordon, he was not much of a player before PEDs. He went on about a year and a half stretch of being a very good hitter with them. And then he signs a big contract extension, gets popped for PEDs, and was never the same. And so for a guy like that, he signed, I think, like a $40-50 million deal. And it's something that wouldn't have been on the table if he hadn't upped his performance in the previous year or two. And I mean, it's hard to say 1-to-1. He started taking PEDs, he became a better hitter. But I mean, if you think that performance enhancing drugs will improve your performance and you're a guy who's not expected to make a lot of money in his career, as sad as it is to say, like for some of those guys, it does make sense, at least to them, to do all that they can to try to make some more money in the big leagues. And it makes sense that the better players in the league aren't taking such drastic steps.
I guess if we want to give Kepler some credit, he did up his average exit velocity by 2 miles per hour in 2025. So perhaps the issue was less with the PEDs and more with just Max Kepler as a hitter, which is not going to surprise many Twins fans at all. Either way, the only other, I guess, notable takeaway from this news to me, as I mentioned, the last two players now to get popped for PEDs were Max Kepler and Jose Alvarado, notably both players for the 2025 Phillies. Is this something that you think the league keeps in the back of their mind? Is it something that as fans we can point to and start to wonder what's going on in Philadelphia? Or do we think this is really just a case of two guys who happen to be playing on the same team making independent decisions for their careers?
I think it's probably the latter, but also I think there's a little bit of an element of like these guys know each other, they're around each other, and maybe they talk about it. And it's two players operating independent of the team, kind of working together on it. We've seen that before where, you know, like an example I would have is like the Guardians with Luis Ortiz and Emmanuel Clase. It's definitely not a team sanctioned thing, but them throwing balls intentionally to try to win bets. It was those two players working together to try to make some extra money. It wasn't sanctioned by the team. It could be the same thing in Philadelphia where you have Alvarado and Kepler. They're on the same team. They're around each other all the time. They're both trying to make more money in their careers, but it's not sanctioned by the team at all. That's definitely possible. Also, I'm not looking at Kepler's numbers at all, but I'm going to guess that the 2 mile per hour increase in exit velocity didn't help him because it was hit straight into the ground. His choppers went a little bit higher.
You would be spot on. Even though his exit velocity was up by 2%, his launch angle was at his career normal. His launch angle sweet spot percentage below his career average, actually, I believe it looks like. Expected batting average, like every number almost across the board remained the same for Kepler because that's just the type of hitter he is. He is such a pull heavy slap hitting hitter, just like Matt said, that you almost, I guess, decrease your value by taking PEDs if you really want to argue it because you're only taking in the risk of taking PEDs, which he obviously got caught for, and clearly it did not work out for him. So, questionable decision, but when you also look at the numbers he was putting out, you can question how many more years he had in the MLB. So, maybe it wasn't that damaging of a decision to his career as he was already unsigned at this point in the offseason before the news dropped. I'd assume he probably doesn't sign at least over the offseason at this point, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how the league as a whole treats him moving forward.
Yeah. The other piece of former Twins news, Ryan Fitzgerald was claimed off waivers by the Dodgers. I think this was kind of expected. Shortstops are always in demand around the league. If a team thinks that Fitzgerald can play at least a passable shortstop, it would make sense for him to get claimed. Also of note, the Dodgers recently hired Rocco Baldelli as an advisor to their front office. So they potentially had some inside information about what they could expect out of Fitzgerald, what kind of clubhouse fit he is. So I wonder if that played into the decision a little bit, but I also don't know how much sway Rocco really has, or that he would use that sway for a marginal guy like Ryan Fitzgerald.
I think that's the much funnier image to me, that the Dodgers are the evil empire. They have all the money, all the resources, all of the best players, and that they brought in Rocco Baldelli and his big insight, his major contribution to being a Los Angeles Dodger now is Ryan Fitzgerald. That is what he brings to the table. No, it's pretty nonsensical, pretty unimportant for I think everybody involved. Obviously, the Twins largely broadcast that they would just rather have Orlando Arcia than Ryan Fitzgerald because they dropped one and gave the other the minor league invite. Obviously, it's a little bit easier just for numbers housekeeping to keep Arcia on the team through at least spring training than it is Fitzgerald. But either way, I think I just get the most laughs, the most joy out of this signing by imagining Rocco Baldelli in a room full of Andrew Friedman and all these geniuses out in LA screaming about Tyler Fitzgerald has decent defense and great leadership skills and really good hair, and that's why he should be a Los Angeles Dodger.
Yeah. Pounding the table for Ryan Fitzgerald is a wild image.
Certainly not one that I would have had on my 2026 bingo card.
Also, the fact that Ryan Fitzgerald and James Outman look identical, and the Twins just acquired James Outman from the Dodgers. Maybe the Dodgers just like, oh man, we can get this guy back for free. Like, we just got a free Brock Stewart. It's like, no, different guy. You just got the pictures confused.
I did see on the Twins subreddit the other week that somebody had posted a goodbye Ryan Fitzgerald post, and then they updated it like a week later, and they mentioned that they did not, in fact, picture Ryan Fitzgerald in this goodbye post. They put a picture of James Outman into the Ryan Fitzgerald post, and they are truly so identical that nobody on the subreddit even noticed or made a comment on it. So who knows? Maybe we'll accidentally see James Outman at shortstop at some point in 2026. But with the recent signings and the way things are trending, that might not be the worst to come for the Twins.
Agreed. So for big news around the league, I think the biggest thing from last week was, of course, all of the arbitration filings. But among those, Tarek Skubal filed for $32 million in his final year of arbitration. That would blow out the record for a pitcher in arbitration, which, funny enough, was set by the Tigers in 2015 with David Price for $19.25 million. And the record for a player in their last year of ARB in general was 31 million by Juan Soto. And so Tarek Skubal is not only trying to set the record for an arbitration pitcher, but it would be by almost $13 million. And that would also be the largest arbitration contract ever awarded. The Tigers, interestingly, are offering Tarek Skubal less than they gave David Price in 2015, coming off of back-to-back Cy Young wins. I feel like the price for the Tigers side is pretty nonsensical. There are some arguments to be made that few pitchers have seen as big of a raise as Skubal has gotten or would get in that situation. But I mean, also in kind of the bylaws for baseball arbitration, I believe it's set up so that your last year free of arbitration is supposed to pay you essentially what you would make on a year by year basis if you were a free agent. So the Tigers are trying to argue that if Tarek Skubal was a free agent, he would sign a multi-year deal that would pay him $19 million per season, which is absolutely not the case. And if you look at it from that lens, Tarek Skubal is underselling his own value at $32 million. But I think the broader thing with this filing is that if Skubal wins, it could have big ramifications for what pitchers are earning in arbitration, and that's going to affect player values quite a lot.
I think that both sides are being a little ridiculous in this situation. Tariq Skubal, definitely a little less so, but to walk into arbitration and say, I believe that I'm the most valuable player that has ever reached arbitration ever, period, full stop, is a little goofy. I understand he is a back to back Cy Young winner. He is indisputably the best pitcher, at least in the American League, probably in the major leagues as a whole. I just I don't think that's a claim that anybody can ever reasonably make and hold up to. I think even for a guy like Tariq Skubal to have asked for 32 million is a little over the top. I would be really curious to see what numbers they talked about and negotiated prior to the numbers they filed, because I have to imagine that they could have talked Scooble off of 32 million if they could have gotten up to like maybe the 27, 28 million range. But it's certainly, I would say, the worst look on the Tigers to not even make him the highest paid pitcher in arbitration history. I haven't done the statistical super deep dive on Scooble versus David Price, but David Price wasn't a back to back Cy Young winner entering his last year of arbitration. This is, as I mentioned before, going to be messy. It's going to be ugly. If we thought that the Twins trying to argue a $500,000 difference in Joe Ryan's value was a little silly and asinine and damaging to club morale, I cannot wait to see the war that erupts over a $13 million argument. I mean, the gap between what Scooble and the Tigers are trying to settle on is almost as large as the amount of money that the Tigers are offering Scooble outright in arbitration. So this will certainly be a fascinating case to watch, not just for the Tigers and Scooble, but for the league as a whole. My biggest, grandest overall takeaway: if the Tigers and Scooble are this far apart on arbitration negotiations, do we really think that they're going to find a way to re-sign him to a long-term deal? Because I sure as hell don't.
Yeah, no, I never thought that Scooble would go back to the Tigers. I feel like he's going to get $500 million from someone and just go be dominant on a coast somewhere. I will say, I think two of the big things that are driving Scooble wanting to reset the market for pitchers. We've seen a lot of inflation in the last decade. You know, player salaries are up quite a bit since 2015. So that alone should have Scooble in a much higher category than David Price, especially coming off of a better platform few seasons. Additionally, we've seen the top end of free agent starting pitchers go up quite a bit, especially on a year by year basis. We've seen guys like Verlander, Scherzer, and Zach Wheeler get over $40 million per year on shorter term deals. So if this is a 1 year deal meant to represent his earning power, it's a very easy argument to say these inferior pitchers at higher ages got $10 million more than I'm asking for, and I think that's something that you could convince a panel of arbiters pretty easily. It's really just going to come down to how their lawyers slash agents get into a room and argue. That's how a lot of the American court system works. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's just how well you can argue. And I think this is going to be quite an argument in the courtroom.
So the reason that I think Scooble's a little bit off base here is because he's so out of line with the entire previous history of arbitration. Not that he wouldn't be worth 32 million. I think if I were the neutral arbiter in this case, I would be more inclined to give Scooble the 32 million because I think that's a better representation of his value. But the Tigers are going to go in there and they're going to make a very fair and reasonable case that there are decades upon decades of precedents that would suggest that Tariq Skubal is not worth 32 million in arbitration because no pitcher's ever been worth 19.25 million in arbitration. And it is going to be hard to argue that Skubal is $12.75 million more valuable than any other pitcher to ever hit arbitration. I understand why Skubal would place his numbers specifically at 32 million, trying to make a statement. trying to reset the top of the market with the highest arbitration settlement ever. But if he really wanted to move the needle, not only for himself, but for players and future arbitration cases, I think it would have been much more reasonable to come in at a $25 million number. It's disappointing. It's understating his value, but I think at that number, it's a slam dunk case. He would have no issue winning in arbitration. And I question if it's worth it to go through the energy and the effort to have probably what's going to end up being a 50-50 shot at hitting your 32 million number when he could have settled for a still
I,
sizable raise over the pitching record and
I
set a
doubt
better
I doubt that
precedent going
that's true.
forward.
Actually, I think this is probably a hardline stance for the Tigers. This is like one of those cases where they are very worried about precedent. So I bet that the reason that there's such a large spread is the Tigers weren't willing to budge much at all over the record for a pitcher.
It's not about the number that they were trying to settle on themselves. It's just that I think that bringing 32 million to the arbitration panel is a bit ridiculous. If I'm Skubal's team, I think that I would be lucky to get 26 million out of the arbitration panel, let alone 32 million. I just think that they're shooting for the moon, and I don't know that they'll get there.
I think they have a decent shot. I can definitely see the argument from his representation standpoint. And also for Skubal, he's the perfect pitcher to try to reset the market because if he goes out and he does win the case and he makes 32 million, yeah, it's great. He makes an extra $13 million this year. But for a guy who's in line to make $400 million in his next contract, it probably doesn't matter all that much. The bigger ramification is that if we know the top of the market is now 32 million, that means that all the pitchers below Skubal are going to be raised up. It's a rising tide lifts all ships type argument. And so for one singular player to be able to have such a large impact on the market and give such a large win potentially to his union, I feel like it makes sense for him to shoot for the moon. If he loses, honestly, $10 million, $13 million, whatever, probably won't matter to Tarek Skubal all that much in the long term. It gives a chance for a lot of guys to make a lot more money. And honestly, I think he has a pretty good argument to be made. And I think pitchers in general have just been underrepresented in arbitration. It's absolutely absurd that that pitchers haven't gotten more than that $19 million that David Price got a decade ago. I just think it's the right time to take a big swing. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But it's a market that's ripe for being reset.
And as a Twins fan, I'm not going to complain too much. This is almost a complete win-win as a Twins fan because either Tariq Skubal is going to get shafted in arbitration. He's only going to be more upset with the Tigers organization. And what was already probably going to be at best a messy divorce between player and team could become really contentious and really ugly with Skubal maybe even forcing his hand and asking out of the deadline if they're just not going to come close to his numbers in potential extension talks. And if Skubal does get his number, that certainly puts a dent in the Tigers' offseason plans in terms of expenditures. And it still probably doesn't get them any closer to extending Skubal, which, as we mentioned, we don't see happening either way. So this is something that in Twinsland, we just get to sit back, kick our feet up, and enjoy watching happen.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, but it's something that probably isn't going to have too much of an effect on the Twins. I will say if Skubal does end up getting his $32 million number, it could diminish the value of arbitration eligible pitchers in general. I think part of the reason that pitchers are so expensive to acquire in trade is there's not that many good pitchers out there. It's just generally a more finite resource starting pitching versus a lot of other positions, but also they're underrepresented in arbitration. They have much lower salaries than you could probably expect and much lower salaries than other positions. And so it gives surplus value to clubs when they're acquiring those arbitration arms. And this matters for the Twins because, as we've talked about, they have a ton of pre arbitration and arbitration eligible pitchers. And so now if Tarek Skubal resets this market, we can expect all of those guys, maybe over their arbitration years, to be making $5, $6, $8 million more, whatever it ends up being, whatever the ramification. It's not a huge change, but that's $6, $8 million in surplus value the Twins can no longer realize, and that could negatively impact them.
Certainly is going to be something to watch going forward. And talking about teams cashing in on that young, controllable pitching talent, the Cubs made their big splash of the offseason so far, at least. Jury's out on Kyle Tucker. They added Edward Cabrera from the Marlins, another one of those Marlins pitchers that felt like he's been in the trade rumors, trade mill forever. Finally lands in Chicago, and it's a pretty sizable package. The Cubs are sending the Marlins Owen Casey, who I believe was their number 2 prospect. He's number 47th on MLB.com's top 100 list. They also land Christian Hernandez and Edgardo de Leon. I believe it was Hernandez who was a formerly highly touted prospect. Either way, this is a pretty big splash on both sides. What's your take off the top? Who won this trade, Matt?
Well, I can see the value for both sides. I mean, for the Cubs, Edward Cabrera has the kind of repertoire that no other pitcher in baseball has. He gets a ton of ground balls, he gets strikeouts, he gets swing and miss. I think there's reason to expect, though, some sequencing changes and his newfound ability to throw the ball in the zone, that he could be sort of a mid-rotation starter, maybe get up to like a number 2 starter kind of territory. But he's a guy who's not very durable. I believe he's never thrown 140 innings in a season. And he also has, as I said, had a hard time finding the strike zone. He's been very inconsistent. And so it's a steep price to pay for that kind of pitcher. We've seen the market be very expensive for high upside but somewhat unproven guys. In a lot of ways, he's in a similar boat to Shane Baz. So I can see why they're taking the leap here, especially because Owen Casey, their number 1 prospect who they traded, comes at a relative position of strength. You know, the Cubs have quite a few outfielders, so it makes sense to clear one of them out to try to bolster the rotation. They do now have kind of a surplus of arms, but as we know, injuries will make that not so much of a surplus pretty quickly into the season. Christian Hernandez, I remember a few years ago, was one of the top international free agents. Honestly, I haven't looked into either of the 2 lower minors guys that they acquired. I just recognized Christian Hernandez's name. He was formerly highly thought of. I know he's middle infield prospect, kind of a guy that they're hoping would fill out and could be a high upside guy. Basically, I think it's Casey, who's close to Major League ready and is a good prospect, and a pair of lottery tickets. And if you're the Marlins and you desperately need offensive impact, that seems like a pretty good return, especially being able to plug Casey pretty much right away into your outfield with Stowers out there. Gives you some hope that they could field a decent offense. So all around, I think it's an interesting deal, but one that makes sense for both sides.
The interesting part here for Twins fans is it's another entry in the pitcher trade market, another sort of marker in terms of pitcher trade value, something that doesn't look as relevant to us now as it maybe did at the start of the offseason when the expectation was that Joe Ryan and or Pablo Lopez were going to be moved. But this is yet another guy who is lesser value than you would get from Pablo or from Joe Ryan. And this went for a top 50 prospect plus 2 lower minors guys. Looking at some of the Christian Hernandez numbers right now, it's not pretty. He's 22 at this point, finished last year only in high A ball with a 694 OPS. A lot of the shine and luster that he had as an international free agent looks like it didn't really pan out. But even just getting Owen Casey straight up for Edward Cabrera, I think, is a phenomenal value if you're the Marlins. Not that Edward Cabrera hasn't been good, hasn't shown a lot of upside, but he didn't necessarily fit their competitive window, and he looks more like a very strong number three starter, very competent number two starter compared to more of an ace that you're going to rely on and ride through the playoffs. So to get a guy with the upside of Owen Casey, I think is spectacular. And it's almost starting to give me a little bit of FOMO. I don't know about you, Matt, but I've almost been able to see these deals come in this offseason and be moved from I don't want to see these guys leave. I think that we should build around Pablo and Joe Ryan to wondering what their value really would be on the open market.
Yeah, I don't know that so much this deal that makes me feel that way. I mean, Owen Casey strikes out a lot. He's kind of a high risk, high reward type of player in a lot of the same ways that Edward Cabrera is. He's kind of a volatile profile. And then the two other players in this deal are, as I said, lottery tickets. You hope they hit, but it's kind of a low probability type of bet. But I agree. In general, we've seen a pretty strong market for starting pitchers. We've seen starting pitchers get traded for large packages. I think the Shane Baz one was really the one that made me think the Twins could get a haul for one of their controllable arms. It's hard to say what they could get exactly because I mean, for Boz or Cabrera, we don't necessarily have a 1-to-1 fit. We either have guys who are more established and better with less control, or we have guys with more control but less upside, or more control and not established. So it's hard to say how the Twins could really capitalize on this market and if these kinds of deals would be out there for their players. But I can definitely see where you're coming from.
I mean, it's a nice problem to have though because we have the combination of potential and talent as well as proven and established output. I think that they if you asked me to rank the pitchers that have been traded this offseason, I think Edward Cabrera would be at the top of my list. I think he's a more exciting pitcher than Shane Baz. I think that the price tag on Edward Cabrera would also probably agree with that. But I think that Pablo and to a greater extent, even Joe Ryan would blow these valuations out of the water. I think either pitcher has the proven output of Edward Cabrera. They've proven that they're even better than him, and they have the exciting intangibles. They have the underlying metrics that Shane Baz has that has made him such an intriguing prospect. So, again, it's not that I'm going to complain about seeing Pablo and Joe Ryan in our rotation next year because love them to death. I will never complain about them being Minnesota Twins. And I do still believe that they could be the foundation of a competitive Twins team here in Minnesota. But if they don't have long term plans for either of those guys, I would be really upset to not see them get moved by the end of the year.
Yeah, I feel like if the Twins are out of it, it's guys that will be in really high demand at the deadline. I think the problem is if the Twins are out of it, there's a good chance that one of those guys is hurt. At which point you can't really cash them in at the deadline. So it's sort of a I don't know, danged if you do, danged if you don't. Because if you trade them now, you're going to be out of it. It's going to be a losing season unless you're acquiring real MLB contributors coming back. And if you wait, then you're either going to still probably be on the fringes of wild card contention, and you're going to be reluctant to trade those guys. And then whether you make the wild card or not, you're going to be losing out on some of their value because they're going to be another year closer to free agency. You have another conundrum to face next offseason. And then if you do miss the playoffs, if you are out of it at the deadline, likely at least one of those guys is injured or underperforming, and that's a big reason why you're out of it. And then you can't get the same return that you could get now. So it's a tough situation. I think we talked earlier this offseason about the Twins wanting the Twins to kind of pick a direction, and it seems like that direction is going to be contending, at least air quotes contending.
Certainly. I think my biggest gripe with the whole trade now versus a deadline two is just the types and qualities of players you're going to get back. It's something we talked about a lot at the last trade deadline that you're just not going to really get MLB quality talent back at the trade deadline because teams aren't prepared to give that up and still be competitive. Not that Jaron Duran wasn't maybe a reasonable return or starting point for Joe Ryan, but the Red Sox were just never realistically going to do that in the middle of the season. And I think if I'm the Twins and I have such surefire value as Joe Ryan and Pablo Lopez, I would like to get either guys that have already proven they're doing it in the major leagues or guys a lot closer to proving it. I I love a Leo DeVries. I think he's probably going to be really good in the major leagues, but I would be a little scared and a little upset if the Twins staked their entire value in their return package to a 19-year-old prospect that is still probably at least 2 years away from debuting. Obviously, not that it's going to be Leo DeVries, but I think that's the same level of prospect we would hope to get back in a trade for one of these guys, at least maybe for Joe Ryan. And I would just rather see the value that the Twins can get back in the offseason rather than trying to cash for more lottery tickets at the deadline.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And the Twins, in all of their moves at the deadline, were targeting guys who can contribute in the big leagues sooner rather than later. We see that with guys like Outman, Roden, Micah Bell, Taj Bradley, Kendry Rojas. Pretty much everyone they acquired was in Double A, Triple A, getting really close to the big leagues outside of Eduardo Tait. So it definitely seems like the Twins agree with your assessment. They would prefer to get major league caliber guys back. And that is very difficult to do at the deadline, especially if you're getting guys already in the big leagues. And honestly, by July, most of the guys that we're looking at now and saying, well, they're in AAA, they're pretty close, they could be up pretty soon. By July, a lot of those guys have debuted and have contributed to teams, and they might be unwilling to trade them. So I agree there. I think if you're looking for big league ready guys and you're still trying to hang around the edges of the wild card race while maybe extending your control window and cashing in on some of these premium pitchers, now would be the time to do it.
Certainly. And to round out our MLB around the horn league wide news, we had some more comments from Rob Manfred, which I'm always going to take with a grain of salt. I think everybody should take everything Rob Manfred said with a grain of salt. But he had two pretty interesting things that he talked about over the last week that I think could play a very realistic and big role in the league going forward. The first one was him throwing out the idea of having a signing deadline for free agents. This would obviously get the off season moving. It would make things more entertaining. It would make for probably a better product from an entertainment standpoint. And of course, all the players hate it. They despise it. They loathe it. They would be very much against it. I honestly don't really know how to feel about this idea at this point. Do you have any thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, adding a hard deadline for players, it only gives the teams leverage. So if you say, you have to sign by January 15th, when you get to January 13th, 14th, the owners and the front offices can say, well, I know you're not going to sit out this year. I know that you're not going to wait till next offseason to sign. So you're going to take one of these low ball deals or you're not going to play. And for players who have a very limited window where they can make money in their careers, the idea of sitting out a year or pushing off their earnings for another year is extremely off putting. So anything that gives the owners leverage in that sort of situation to potentially tamp down the values on these contracts or stiff arm sort of the middle class of free agents is going to be kind of a non-starter for players. And I don't expect that we'll see something like this happen. I personally like the way the offseason paces out. I feel like it's always pretty slow in November and December as we're getting through the holidays and we have football going on. I don't really need to be that invested in baseball. It's a good time to kind of assess your own team, assess needs, and then prepare. And then it feels like it really ramps up in the new year every year. And some of the movement in January, February gets us ready for spring training. And I think that's kind of how I enjoy the off season. But I can see how fans might not feel the same way.
Yeah, this definitely feels like a very half baked idea to me. Something that I would assume, I guess, the league has discussed more in depth if Rob Manfred is bold enough to be on the record talking about it. But I would need to see a lot more details about how it's going to work because for some guys, signing deadline just would not be feasible. You look at every offseason, there's going to be a handful of guys. Like, I think this offseason, the most notable would be Evan Phillips, who we've talked about before, where he's entering the offseason hurt. He knows he's not going to be ready to play by opening day, probably not even closer to the trade deadline. It would be all sorts of nonsensical for him to go out and be forced to sign a deal by the end of February when he doesn't even know when or if he's going to play in 2026. And that would certainly diminish his market with a lot of teams trying to exercise caution around that. Outside of that, it's just kind of a rite of passage at this point, I feel like, for a lot of your craftier veterans hanging on to the last few years of their career to take more time to get uh, heated up from the off season, take more time to get ready for the regular season. A lot of these guys prioritize playing time and opportunity over everything else, and that's something that for many clubs doesn't really materialize until after spring training has even started. So I think that the biggest bust for this decision would be those fringe guys, guys that are fighting to prolong their careers, guys that are facing concerning, kind of scary injuries. And of all the free agents, of all the types of players for the league to target with such a new rule, that feels like really low hanging fruit to beat off the bush just to save a couple of bucks to me.
Yeah, I also think there's a lot of times where spring training injuries start to factor in for the really bottom of the market guys. So you'll see players get hurt the first few weeks of spring training, and the teams say, "Well, we need someone to play first base in 6 weeks, so it looks like we're signing someone." I mean, the Twins kind of got in that situation in 2023, where we got to the beginning of March and it was, well, Donovan Solano's here. Let's give him $2 million, and he can kind of play first base. And if we had a signing deadline, it's unclear what kind of market Donovan Solano would have had at all. And he went on to have arguably the best season of his career with the Twins that year. And so it's the kind of players like that that would get kind of squeezed out in this situation. And a lot of them would have to settle for minor league deals or really cheap contracts with incentives, but then teams could always cut bait on them if they don't need them. It would just get really messy, especially for the bottom of the market. And I think it's just something that wouldn't happen. Like I feel like the players are going to see this as a non-starter. Major League Baseball sees it as a marketing opportunity. And, they're doing anything they can to try to get the game in front of more fans. But I think baseball is a unique beast, and it's probably not something that's going to be applicable for the sport. And also, like we've seen veteran players, even when they're not hurt, choose to sign mid-season. Like David Robertson's done that the last 2 years, where he's waited until like June, look around, see who's a contender, who he wants to go pitch for, and then he'll sign and throw for 3 months and give them some midseason reinforcements. Rich Hill did that for a while, where he would wait for a pitching injury, and then June, July rolls around, and Rich Hill's pitching for the Kansas City Royals or whatever. So I think it just cuts down the creativity that the players can have, especially older players who maybe don't want to play for 6 months. And I think it's just not going to be a popular enough thing with the players to make them want to agree to it.
Yeah, the initial returns definitely make it sound like this is going to be so unpopular that it's not going to be considered, at least in this CBA. But the other thing Manfred spoke on, which does seem like it's going to be a lot more relevant, a lot more recent, or that does seem like it's going to be a lot more relevant more quickly, is realignment. The MLB obviously hasn't came out with any concrete plans yet for expansion, but presumably any form of realignment would come with expansion. So this is still something that we're talking probably like 3, 4 years down the line rather than something that we'd be kicking the tires on this offseason. But I do think it's interesting that the league has clearly already put a lot of consideration into realignment, noting or suggesting that they are definitely still looking for expansion as well. And Manfred's really only comment on the matter was that they would not be putting same city markets in the same competitive group, and that if they were to realign with a possible expansion, that it would be primarily geography east west focused.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Baseball, and Manfred talked about this, but baseball is unique in that you're asking players to play 162 games in 183 days. And so currently that relies on a lot of travel, even on off days. Players are traveling a ton. And so to have teams more focused in a smaller geographical area, you're playing your divisional rivals more, and you're not having to travel very far for those games, I think makes sense. It reduces the wear and tear on the players. That being said, I think expansion as a whole, I'm torn on whether or not it would be beneficial for the Twins. On the one hand, you're diluting the player talent to two more teams. And so theoretically, those two new markets are going to be smaller than the Twins. They'll have less spending power. They're going to be doing some sort of expansion draft. So they're going to have non premier players. And across the league, every team's going to get thinner. So theoretically, you can say, well, it gives two more teams for the Twins to beat up on. It's two teams who should have less resources than them. But at the same time, you can look at like the Dodgers and say, well, they're still going to get their stars. They're still going to have as deep of a roster. They're still going to be good. And all that it does is take a little bit of talent away from the Twins to go to an expansion team, and it makes them further from contention. So I think as far as expansion, it's probably a net loss for the Twins. And then, I mean, you look at the AL Central, and it's the worst division in baseball for the last 15 years. And so any sort of realignment where the Twins are moving to a group with a different they're grouped in with different teams, it's going to be a negative because they've had such a weak division for so long.
Yeah, it's certainly that's probably the biggest takeaway I would say for Twins impact. But I do have to say that I'm really intrigued and excited about the idea of realignment, even if it's maybe not in our best interest. I think it could honestly be fun to get some maybe more natural rivals, geographical rivals, and it would just be shaking up the league, and that's something that I'm almost always all for. As much as there's a lot of history behind a lot of the matchups and a lot of the rivalries already in the league, I don't necessarily think those would have to disappear. And we don't have a ton of that in the AL Central. These are some pretty historic teams, but they haven't necessarily done a lot with that history. And certainly more recently, as you alluded to, with everybody being so bad, I don't think there's been any two teams that have been good enough long enough to really constitute anything close to a rivalry in the AL Central. So just for that sake, maybe it is time to spice things up a bit. Even if our competition gets tougher, just seeing something new so I don't have to watch 30 games of the Twins versus the White Sox and then the Royals and then the Guardians, pre-September Guardians, who are always just out of the world. It gets boring after a while, and if the Twins aren't going to shake anything up, at least maybe the MLB could, so we would have something new to watch.
I disagree. I will always passionately despise teams like the Guardians, who are just always beating up on the Twins. You've Josh Naylor hitting 3-run bombs in the eighth inning to take a lead. I just have so many bad memories of the Twins bullpens blowing leads to guys like Josh Naylor and Carlos Santana, or like the Tigers dominating us for most of the 2010s. The Royals are cool. Who cares about the Royals? The White Sox are almost always terrible. Fine with them. But like I very much, it might be a one-sided rivalry, but I feel a rivalry with the Guardians and Tigers.
I mean, if we're gonna count one-sided rivalries, I think that nobody would contest that the biggest rivalry in Twinsland is still the Yankees. At least in my heart, even if we've gotten over our own playoff hump, we've picked up playoff wins, we've started to put that in the rearview mirror. I think it will forever and always first be the Yankees that I hate and despise with a passion. And thankfully, I don't think that we'd really have to see them in any form of potential realignment. But there's some teams that I think I would honestly be more excited to start up rivalries with than the ones we currently have. Like, even if it's going to be one sided, it'd be a lot more fun to be rivals with, say, the Milwaukee Brewers, who are a lot closer to us and in a very similar market and therefore team building setting than, say, a team like the White Sox or the Tigers all the way out in Detroit. So I think there could be a lot of good to come from realignment. I'm curious to see who are some of the teams that you think would be in our new division logically with realignment, and who's maybe a team or two that you just really hope we would get to see more often.
Well, I think the Brewers would definitely still be in our division. I think the White Sox probably still would be, just geographically. After that, it gets a little all over the place. You could see maybe like the Tigers, maybe the Guardians. It's really any team in like the Great Lakes area uh, would probably be in the Twins division. I don't know that there's any teams I'm necessarily hoping for the Twins to get grouped with. Honestly, I think I'm used to low level of competition in the division and a couple of teams that I really dislike. So I don't know that I'm necessarily looking for the Twins to have a new matchup every year, a new rivalry. But is there anyone you're particularly interested in?
I think I would be more interested in seeing kind of a centralized division, which does less of leaking out into the East Coast with teams like Cleveland and Detroit. But keep Minnesota, keep the Royals in the division, keep the Brewers in the division, give us one of the Chicago teams. That gets us to four. Why not add Colorado to the mix? That would definitely be more of a self serving pick, but Colorado's kind of in the middle of no man's land with any team and any sort of alignment. I guess they line up the best where they're at right now, being more of a West Coast team, but they're just as far from Houston or Los Angeles as they are from Minneapolis. So I think that could be a fun one just because the Rockies baseball has always been bad, but it's also fun baseball. Like Coors Field is absolutely gorgeous. Who doesn't love park inflated numbers, watching guys just absolutely moonbeam balls in that Denver air? I think that Colorado, not only would it be a strategically good fit for the Twins, it's a team that I would like to see a lot more of going forward.
Yeah, but I think every team in baseball could say that exact same argument. It's like they suck and it's fun to watch. It's like, yeah, well, every team wants that. So,
Every team does want that, but few teams both A need that crutch to stand on like the Twins, and B could make a reasonable geographic claim. I think it's just kind of spitballing. I would imagine the closest team geographically to the Rockies is probably the Royals. So
the Diamondbacks too.
yeah, that's another fair shout, which again pulls them more towards that West Coast. But either way, this will certainly be more interesting to watch because I think this is a more concrete idea that's definitely going to happen. It's just more of a when, not if, compared to some of Manfred's other comments.
Yeah, agreed. So I think we can move back into some twin specific talk. Last week we started the first of our weekly positional deep dives. We talked about second base with Luke Keeschel and Edouard Julien. This week we're going to be talking about catcher. So obviously the two big pieces on the roster are Ryan Jeffers and Alex Jackson. Starting with Ryan Jeffers, some of the benefits he brings to the table, I think Twins fans are pretty familiar with. He's an above average hitter, especially when you factor in that he plays a very demanding, tough position at catcher, which generally comes with a lower bar for offense. He's a genuinely plus hitter in that regard. He plays a lot of games. He's been durable. He kind of has split time with Christian Vasquez over the last few years, but he spent minimal time on the injured list. I think last season with his concussion was the first time in the last 3 years that he'd been on the injured list. And he generally plays passable defense. He's a little bit below average, but it's not so bad where he's giving back a lot of the runs that he's getting you on offense. So overall, he's just an above average hitting passable catcher. That's definitely a positive. The bar for an everyday catcher is pretty low, but it's not to say that Ryan Jeffers doesn't have some negatives. Number one, over the last 2 years, his power production has really fallen off. He's talked about wanting to be less reliant on slugging. He's made real changes to his approach to try to have a higher on base percentage, try to strike out less. And we've seen that in the numbers. Over the last couple of years, his strikeout rate has fallen, his walk rate has gone up. He has maintained generally the same WRC plus that he had before, but it's been at the expense of a lot of his power. And I don't know that that's necessarily a great trade off, especially when you look at, I think, 2 seasons ago when he was slugging and getting on base. That's what you'd like to see. And I don't know that that's likely to keep happening with his current approach. He only has 1 year of control remaining, so he's a short term solution. And while he is passable behind the plate, he's not a great defender. He's struggled blocking. That's been a long-standing issue, and his throwing has been off and on. So, Eric, what are your overall thoughts on Ryan Jeffers?
I really like and appreciate what Ryan Jeffers brings to this team, but I'm going to get back on the horse that I was riding for the start of the season, and I still think that he's our most valuable trade chip in terms of position players. And if he's not a guy that they're going to bring back, which I, for all intents and purposes, don't really see them doing right now, I would still like to see Jeffers get moved at the deadline at the least, just because the Twins are not a team that can afford to just let talent walk out the door in free agency at any cost, at any level, more or less. But also because while Jeffers does carry some value, I think that it's minimal, it's marginal. I think the bat is decently above average for a catcher, but if there's one place where I expect the bat to fall off the hardest, the fastest, it's at catcher. And as you mentioned, there's already enough defensive concerns. I mean, the Baseball Savant page does not look great. He is 13th percentile in blocks above average, -4. His framing grades out negatively. His pop time is in the bottom third of the league. Is caught stealing above average. As you mentioned, he's had trouble throwing the ball in the past. Is in the 5th percentile last year. So I think that the luster's already starting to fade a bit from Ryan Jeffers, and I worry that if we spend the whole season driving him into the ground, making him catch 120, 130 games, that there won't be much left here by the end of the season.
I I get what you're saying. I definitely see the argument that the Twins can't let his value kind of die on the vine. He needs to get traded, realize his value in a year when the Twins are probably at best a wild card contender. But I do kind of disagree with the idea that his value is minimal. Looking at the last 3 years, he's been worth between 1.6 and 2.3 WAR while being in a timeshare. So every year he's been at least a good starter. And looking at his projections this year, it's obviously factoring in a lot more playing time with Vasquez gone. But across 5 different projection systems on Fangraphs, he's projected for between 2.3 WAR and 3 WAR. So that's an above average regular, especially at a very hard to fill position. I mentioned earlier he's an above average hitter for a catcher. Generally, the bar for offense for a starting catcher is around a 90 WRC plus, and he has not been below a 90 WRC plus since 2022. In the last 3 years, he's been an above average hitter for even non catchers. So I think he's a valuable piece for a team that's contending, but it's worthwhile to ask, are the Twins really going to contend, and is this the best way to spend his one remaining year of control?
you're not wrong that we could be wildly misjudging the value of Ryan Jeffers on the trade market right now. But I think that could also allude to the potential value of Ryan Jeffers on the trade market, because when is the last time we've seen a catcher of even his value get tossed around in a deal? Obviously, Wilson Contreras just got dealt to the Red Sox. I don't think anybody really views him as a catching option anymore. We have every year a ton of low wattage deals that is more or less just teams shuffling around defensive minded backup catchers. Could say the same thing about Alex Jackson, who the Twins just brought in, that we're going to talk about in a moment. But I think that the fact we haven't seen a catcher of Jeffers' value even on the trade market in quite some time would speak to the fact that there's got to be somebody interested out there, somebody who wants to make a sizable catcher upgrade. And outside of signing JT Realmuto, I think Jeffers could be the best available catcher in baseball this offseason if the Twins wanted to make him so.
Yeah, agreed. Uh, as you alluded to, the other Twins option at catcher is Alex Jackson. He's kind of an interesting player. So he was a former sixth overall pick back in, I believe, 2014. He was a top prospect who really struggled to hit as he got up into the upper minors. And he hasn't done a whole lot in his big league career. He debuted in 2019, and from 2019 up until last year, he was a well below average hitter. He's always shown a pretty solid glove, but he's gotten limited playing time and it's been pretty abysmal at the plate. I think the reason the Twins were interested is his mechanics of the plate changed quite a bit this past year. Again, referencing Parker Hageman on Twitter, he noticed that Alex Jackson opened up his stance more than 6 degrees. His stance was also wider. And he also seemed to be more. He tried to pull the ball in the air a lot more. And we saw that bared out in the numbers, where his pulled fly ball percentage went from 17% up to 24.1%. And he also was just swinging the bat a lot harder. His bat speed rose over a mile and a half per hour, almost getting up into Matt Wallner territory. Also, the percentage of his fast swings went up. That's a new stat that a lot of teams have been leaning into. It's one thing to be able to swing the bat hard once or twice, but you want a guy who can really attack the ball the majority of the time. And Alex Jackson was doing that this past year, and we saw his barrel rate jump over 5.5%. He is the kind of hitter who could be ready for a late career breakout. I feel like when we see hitters go from being a bad player to a good player, the one thing that I'm looking for is real mechanical changes, and Alex Jackson has made those. It's not to say that there aren't negatives in his profile. He's still swinging and missing a lot. He's still chasing out of the zone. I believe he struck out at about a 36% rate, 37% rate last year with the Orioles. So he's still going to strike out, but he at least has some upside in the bat. And when it's coming with a hitter who it plays a very valuable position on defense, he's a catcher. He has graded out above average in both controlling the run game and framing. He's a solid blocker. I think it's a higher upside backup catcher option than we were expecting coming into the offseason. And he's a guy that I'm at least somewhat excited about. And I think the defense gives him a pretty high floor.
Yeah, this is to me kind of the other flip side to pursuing a Ryan Jeffers trade is it was pretty much free for the Twins to go out and get Alex Jackson, and like you just laid out, there's a lot to like here. There's at the very least a solid floor of a very defensively sound catcher with the potential for some maybe late breakout in the bat. He was, by the numbers statistically, more productive than Ryan Jeffers last year. And granted, half the sample size, maybe even less, but when you talk about being able to offer an above average bat while playing good defense at catcher, I think that Alex Jackson certainly runs laps around Jeffers as a defensive catcher. So if he could even keep like 80% of this added production from last year and settle in at a true league average hitter, I think you could just make the case that Alex Jackson ends up being more valuable this season than Ryan Jeffers. Certainly, I think that's still a lot to ask for, and that's also assuming another relatively quiet year from Jeffers. We've seen him hit a lot better than he did in 2025, and I guess the idea is that maybe with more consistent playing time in 2026, he'll be able to get around to some of his production again that we've seen in the past, but it makes it a lot easier to stomach the idea of trading a previous franchise cornerstone like Ryan Jeffers when we're able to go out and identify a guy like Alex Jackson and bring him into the offseason, because I think that he will be a really fun guy to watch entering the start of the season at least.
Yeah, I will say, for as much as we have some optimism around Alex Jackson, his projected WRC plus on fan graphs is generally somewhere in the 70s versus Ryan Jeffers being up around 105 to 110. So it is a massive downgrade offensively. Yes, Alex Jackson's a better defender, but I mean, we would need pretty much all of his improvements from last year to stick, and for him to still be pretty lucky with some batted balls to get up to a similar level as Jeffers offensively. I mean, just looking at last year, again, it's only a 100 plate appearance sample, so it's hard to really extrapolate, but he had a 37% strikeout rate. It's only a 5% walk rate. That's pretty terrible. To me, that just screams a guy who swings and misses in the zone, but also chases a lot. And usually, over a larger sample size, pitchers are able to exploit that. And it would undermine some of his newfound power if he's just not able to make contact in the zone or force pitchers to come into the zone to let that power play. So I think Jackson is more interesting than a normal backup, but I definitely think he'd be stretched in a full time role.
Certainly. I mean, if you look at his baseball savant page, he had unreal barrel numbers, bat speed numbers, and launch angle numbers. But everything outside of that is also unreal and not in the way you would hope. That is why he was a backup. That is why he was so cheap to go out and get this offseason. And it doesn't necessarily bode well for sustained major league success. You could argue it's a kind of similar issue to what Eddie Julian has run into, where if he's able to get to the ball on his terms, he's gonna hit the crap out of it, but there's just not enough consistent damage for pitchers to respect him enough to give him his pitch to hit. So this could ultimately end up being more of a wash, which is what I think a lot of people would have expected from an Alex Jackson level addition in the offseason. And I do think that he's going to have to earn his playing time this year compared to years past, where the Twins have been very content to put Ryan Jeffers into a 50-50 or 60-40 timeshare, even with a clearly inferior catcher and a guy like Christian Vasquez. I do think that this is going to start a lot more heavily skewed towards Ryan Jeffers, but that also makes things kind of exciting because if we do see a lot more of Alex Jackson this year, that means it's going to be for a good reason.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think that's really all that we have for this week. As always, you can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Also, Eric and I are on Twitter. We're at the Talk Twins on Twitter, I think is our podcast handle, and then we're both tagged in the bio there, so you can find us. Anytime the Twins make a move, we're trying to tweet about it before the podcast comes out. So if you want our first thoughts on any moves, feel free to look on Twitter. By the time this episode comes out, we'll be about 4 weeks from the start of spring training. So expect a lot of movement over the next few weeks and getting excited for some spring baseball.